The morning they threw me out, it was raining. Not the cinematic kind, not the soft curtain of drops that makes grief look beautiful in films. This was the kind of rain that comes sideways, that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, that turns the gutters into small rivers carrying cigarette butts and receipts for things people no longer need. I stood on the marble steps of the Valdres Group headquarters with a cardboard box and a security escort and 14 months of work dissolving in the wet, and I thought, this is what small feels like. This is the exact shape of invisible. Her name was in the lobby behind me, carved into a wall of black granite in letters 2 feet high. Marin Valdres. I had never met her. I had spent 14 months as a junior analyst in the 43rd floor office of her North American operations, without once breathing the same air as the woman who owned the building, the company, the city's skyline, and, if the financial press was to be believed, approximately 9% of the country's private infrastructure. She was 34. She had restructured 3 failing continental empires before she turned 30. She was known in boardrooms from Seoul to Zurich by a single phrase that her rivals used the way you use a name for something you fear and cannot control. They called her the Iron Meridian. They said it quietly, and they said it first. I had heard her voice exactly once through the glass wall of the 43rd floor conference room, 8 months into my employment. It was a low voice, unhurried, the kind of voice that has never once needed to be raised, because the room always goes quiet before it gets there. She had been dismissing someone, I did not know who, I never learned, and the words had carried through the glass with total clarity. Throw him out. 3 months after that, they threw me out. The grounds were performance insufficiency, per the termination form they handed me in a sealed envelope, and I stood in the rain with that envelope already pulping at the corners, and I thought about what performance insufficiency meant, when the work I had done had been submitted under my supervisor's name and had earned him a promotion to the 45th floor. I thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. Then, I stopped thinking about it, because the security guard who had escorted me out was watching me with the particular pity that people reserve for situations they are glad are not theirs, and I had too much left in me to accept that pity. Not much left, but too much. My name is Sable Ochterberg. I was 26. I was an omega in a world that considered that a useful piece of information about what I was worth. I had a degree in forensic financial analysis from a university no one at the Valdres Group had heard of, a bicycle with a bent rear wheel that I had chained to a parking meter 2 blocks east, and a bank account that had $412 in it. I had no mate, no pack, no one waiting at home. I had a best friend named Odette who was going to be furious when she heard what happened, and I had the kind of stubbornness that reads as arrogance to people who expected me to fold quietly. I did not fold. I got on my bicycle in the rain, and I pedaled home. What happened next took 3 years to fully understand, and this is the story of understanding it. But to understand it, I have to go back to the thing no one in that office knew about me. The thing I had spent 14 months hiding in the fluorescent lit box of my cubicle, processing in the margins of legitimate work, speaking to no one about. Not even Odette. I had found something in the Valdres Group's subsidiary ledgers, something that could not be explained by accounting error or aggressive write-off strategy. Something that had a shape. Numbers always have a shape if you look long enough, and I had looked. I had copied everything onto a flash drive that was currently taped inside the spine of a water-damaged paperback novel at the bottom of my cardboard box. I had not yet decided what to do with it. The rain let up somewhere around 4th Avenue. By the time I unlocked my apartment door, 4th floor, no elevator, the lock sticking on the left as it always did, I was only damp and not soaked, and I stood in the center of my kitchen and held the cardboard box and thought about what a 26-year-old Omega with a forensic accounting degree, $412, and a flash drive of compromising financial data does next. I made tea. Then I called Odette. She was furious, as predicted. She said 4 things that I am not going to repeat, and 1 thing I will keep forever, which was, "You are the only person in that building who actually knew what they were doing, and they will spend years discovering that." Then she said she was bringing food, and 45 minutes later, she arrived with dumplings and the particular facial expression she wore when she had decided to be practical instead of furious, because fury had already been done, and now there was a next step to figure out. Odette Park was a beta, small and direct and constitutionally incapable of softening a truth. She had been my person since university, where we had met in the library at 2 a.m. over competing claims to the last available charging outlet, and she had sized me up in 30 seconds and declared that I was too stubborn to be anyone's friend and therefore she would be mine. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to me. She sat across from me at my small table, and she ate 3 dumplings in a row without speaking, which meant she was thinking. Then she said, "What are you going to do with what you found?" I wrapped both hands around my mug. Outside, the rain had started again. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her it was complicated. I told her the shape of what I had found was the shape of something that went very high, and I needed to be careful about how I moved with it. Odette put down her chopsticks and looked at me with the expression she had for moments when she had already seen 3 steps ahead and was waiting for me to catch up. She said, "How high?" I said, 45th floor, maybe higher. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. The week after I was terminated, I did 3 things. I filed for my final paycheck and severance, knowing the severance would be contested. I registered as an independent contractor under a tax ID I had established 2 years earlier as a theoretical precaution, and I took the flash drive to a notary and had its contents witnessed, dated, and sealed in a legal envelope I sent to my own mailing address, unopened, evidence of the shape of things, in case the shape ever needed to be proved. I did not do anything with the data yet. The timing was wrong. I did not know enough about who had built the structure I had found, and I could not afford to move without knowing. An analyst who files a complaint with no corroboration and no standing is not a whistleblower. She is a dismissed employee with a grievance. The difference matters enormously, and I knew the difference. I found contract work. 3 clients in the first month, 2 forensic analysis referrals through a professor from university who had always said I saw things other analysts missed, and 1 small business owner who needed someone to explain why his quarterly projections and his actuals kept disagreeing in the same direction. I fixed his projections in 4 hours and charged him $500, and he told his brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law told someone else. It was not the Valdres Group. It was $412 becoming something more stable, client by client, in a 1-bedroom apartment where I worked at a kitchen table under a single lamp. I was fine. I was building. I was careful. What I did not know, because I had no way of knowing, was that 3 blocks north and 40 floors up, in the glass and steel headquarters that I could see from my kitchen window on clear days, something had gone wrong. Something had been going wrong for some time. And the shape of what had gone wrong was exactly the shape of what I had found in the subsidiary ledgers, and it was getting larger. 3 years later, Marin Valdres would tell me she had spent those 3 years looking for the analyst who had vanished from her 43rd floor before she ever had a chance to find her. I did not know that yet. What I knew on a Tuesday morning 14 months after my termination was that I was 27 years old and sitting in a hospital waiting room holding a number on a paper ticket, having just been told by a doctor whose expression I still could not fully decode that I was not alone anymore. I was, for the first time in my life, completely terrified. The twins came at 36 weeks, 2 omegas, 4 pounds 11 ounces, and 4 pounds 8 ounces respectively, in a labor ward at St. Ambrose General on a night in March when the temperature dropped to 12 degrees and the windows of the room grew thick with condensation, and the nurse who stayed with me the whole time was named Geraldine and had a voice that felt like something solid to hold on to. I had no mate. I had Odette, who held my left hand so hard she left marks I didn't notice until the next day, and I had Geraldine. And I had the particular furious focus that had always been my primary coping mechanism. My daughters were named Petra and Rook. Petra came first and announced herself immediately, squalling in a register that the nurses described as impressive, and Odette described, later, as inherited. Rook came 7 minutes after and was quieter and looked at me from the moment they placed her on my chest with the expression of someone who had arrived with an agenda. They were 4 days old when I brought them home on the subway because I could not afford a car, with Odette on one side and a double stroller I had bought second-hand from a woman in the Bronx. And I stood in my one-bedroom apartment and looked at 2 very small people asleep in a second-hand crib in my living room, and I thought, everything I do from now on is load-bearing. I did not know who their alpha was. That is not a statement I make lightly, and it is not a statement that means what some people assume it means. It means that heat is not a choice, and that what follows heat is not always a name you know, and that the designation system that the world uses to organize human worth had, in this particular case, simply produced 2 small people who were mine and whose existence I was not capable of understanding as anything other than the most significant thing that had ever happened to me. I told Odette this at 3 a.m. while I was learning to nurse for the first time, and everything hurt, and Rook kept making a sound against my collarbone that I later understood was purring, the earliest proto-purr of an omega infant, and it felt like the most expensive and most important thing I had ever earned. Odette said, "I know. I can see it on your face." I said, "What do you see?" She said, "Someone who just found out what she's made of." I went back to work 6 weeks later, contract work, from the kitchen table, while the girls slept in their crib 3 feet away. My clients did not know about the twins. The twins did not know about my clients. The world in which I was a forensic analyst and the world in which I was a mother existed in the same apartment but in different registers, and I moved between them in the hours the other was quiet. The flash drive was still in the spine of the water-damaged novel. I had not forgotten it. I had been waiting until I had enough to make it count. Petra and Rook were 2 years and 3 months old when they began speaking in full sentences, both of them on the same day, as though they had been consulting with each other in the crib and decided simultaneously that silence had gone on long enough. Petra's first full sentence was a demand. Rook's first full sentence was a question. This established a dynamic that would not change. They were 2 years and 9 months old, nearly 3, when the woman who owned the building I could see from my kitchen window sat in a car outside my apartment and did not know that was what she was doing. She did not know because she was not looking for me yet. She was looking for something else. I did not know she was there. 3 years had passed since the rain and the cardboard box and the granite letters 2 feet high in the lobby. I was 29. I had 23 clients. I had moved the crib to the alcove and turned the living room back into a working space. which meant the girls' nap schedules governed the hours between 9 and 1, and again between 2 and 4. And I worked in a state of focused quiet that Odette said was the most productive silence she had ever witnessed. I had a number. I had built it carefully, piece by piece, and the number was enough to run for another 18 months on savings alone if the contracts dried up, which they would not, because I was the person who saw what other analysts missed and clients told their brothers-in-law. The flash drive data, which I had been supplementing over 3 years through legally obtained public filings and cross-referenced subsidiary disclosures, now told a story that was no longer just a shape. It was a structure. It had names. It had a timeline. And it pointed, with the clarity of something that cannot be explained any other way, to a man on the 45th floor of the Valdres Group who had been systematically stripping funds from 3 dormant subsidiary trusts across 14 months, using a mechanism that would not have been visible to anyone who was not looking for it across all 3 entities simultaneously, because the 3 entities did not appear to be related in any public documentation. They were related. I had the proof. The man's name was Declan Hoff. He had been the Valdres Group's deputy director of North American operations. He was the man who had taken my analysis, put his name on it, gotten promoted to the 45th floor, and filed my termination paperwork 4 weeks later. I had been careful for 3 years. I had been building for 3 years. The structure was complete. I called the number of the Valdres Group's legal counsel. The receptionist asked my name and the nature of my call. I said, "My name is Sable Ochterberg. I have evidence of internal fraud in the Valdres Group's North American subsidiary trust accounts. The mechanism is complex, and the documentation is complete. I would like to speak with whoever is responsible for receiving that kind of information, and I would like to do it before whoever is responsible for the fraud discovers that I'm the one who found it." The pause on the line lasted 8 seconds. Then the receptionist said, "Please hold." I did not expect what happened next. I do not think anyone could have expected it. What happened was that I held for approximately 90 seconds, and then the line clicked, and the voice that came through was low and unhurried, and I recognized it immediately, in the way you recognize something your body has cataloged separately from your memory. A voice heard once through glass 3 years ago, on a rainy day that ended with a cardboard box. It said, "Miss Ochterberg, I'm told you have something I need to hear." And the scent of her, juniper and struck iron, cold and precise as a compass needle, came through the phone not at all, of course, because scent does not travel through phones. But I would learn that scent later. I would learn it so well that I could find it in a room by memory. I said, "Yes, I believe I do." She said, "Come up." The offices on the 47th floor smelled like cold air and expensive paper, and something underneath both of those that I did not identify until I was standing in front of her desk, and she stood up, and then the scent hit me like a change in atmospheric pressure. Juniper and struck iron. Cold and clean, and something that my designation-specific neurology processed as authority before my rational mind had a chance to form an opinion about it. She was taller than her photographs. She was wearing charcoal and white with a precision that looked like architecture rather than fashion, everything load-bearing, nothing decorative. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that said the face had nothing to hide and nothing to perform. She was looking at me with eyes the color of November water, and the looking was not the looking of a CEO performing attentiveness. It was actual assessment. I felt my own scent shift, orange blossom and warm cedar, my natural signature, and then deliberately studied it, because I had not survived 3 years as an unmated Omega analyst with twin daughters by letting my scent telegraph my state to every alpha in the room. She noticed the steadying. I could see her notice it. She said, "Sit down, Miss Achterberg." I sat. I opened my bag. I placed on her desk a printed summary document, 23 pages, with every exhibit cross-referenced by page number in the attached evidence packet. I placed beside it a small flash drive labeled in my own handwriting with the case number I had assigned it 3 years earlier. She looked at the flash drive for a moment before she looked at the document. Then she looked up at me and said, "You've had this for 3 years." It was not a question, not quite an accusation. It was the thing that the question and the accusation had become when someone with her kind of intelligence encountered something they had not fully predicted. I said, "I had evidence of a shape for 3 years. I had a complete structure for 6 weeks." The difference matters. Something changed in her face. It was small, and it was the kind of small that I would later learn to read fluently, but at that moment I only registered it as information, without context. This statement has affected her in a way she did not expect. She picked up the document. She read the first 2 pages without speaking. Then she set it down and pressed a button on her desk and said, to whoever answered, "Get me Lyra." Now, the woman who came in 40 seconds later was a beta, broad-shouldered, 40 or so, with close-cropped silver-black hair and the scent of cool graphite and dry wood. She moved like someone who had spent a long time being trusted in rooms where things were decided, and she looked at me the way she might look at a piece of equipment she had not been told was in the room. Marin, I was still thinking of her as Marin Valdris, not yet as Marin, said to her, "This is the source. I need the legal team in the conference room in 30 minutes, and I need you to personally verify her safety chain. She's kept this documentation for 3 years without it being touched." The woman called Lyra looked at me again. Differently this time. She said, "You kept it clean." I said, "I had it notarized the week I was terminated. The original sealed copy is in a safety deposit box and has been there since." Lyra said, almost to herself, "Who terminates someone who knows this much?" Marin said, "Someone who thought she was invisible." She was reading the document again when she said it. She was not looking at me. But the words landed in the center of the room like something placed there deliberately, and I felt the particular warmth of being correctly described by someone who had no obligation to describe you at all. I noted the warmth. I did not trust it yet. Trust was a structure too, and I knew better than to build it before I understood the foundation. The meeting with the legal team lasted 4 hours. I presented. I answered questions. I demonstrated the cross-referencing methodology that made the 3 dormant subsidiary trusts resolve into a single structured extraction pattern. The Valdris Group's head of internal investigation, a former prosecutor, terse, respectful, asked 3 questions I had anticipated and 1 I had not, and I answered the one I had not anticipated with the phrase "I'm glad you asked" that "let me show you," and opened the exhibit on page 17 that explained exactly why the question was right and what the answer told you about the timeline. Marin Valdris sat at the head of the table for all 4 hours. She did not perform attentiveness. She paid it. At the end, when the legal team had taken possession of the documentation and the conversation had moved into procedural territory that did not require me, I gathered my bag and stood to leave. Marin said my name. She said Sable, not Miss Achterberg, and it was the first time, and I registered it, and when I turned, she was looking at me with an expression I could not yet fully read. She said, "How long ago were you terminated?" I said, 3 years and 2 months. She said, "Your work was submitted under Hoff's name for 14 months before that." I have the original file timestamps now. I had them within the first 20 minutes of reviewing your exhibit structure, because your methodology is distinctive, and it's the same methodology in every analysis that went up the chain under his byline. I held the strap of my bag and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than the silence. She said, "I want to offer you your position back, director level, with the salary and authority that should have accompanied the work you were doing. And I want to do it now, not after the investigation concludes, because the investigation is going to take 4 months, and I would like to not waste another 4 months." I said, "I have my own clients now." She said, "I know. I looked you up this morning. 23 clients, 4-star average on every independent review platform that tracks forensic contractors, 2 academic citations from a university paper on structured subsidiary analysis published 8 months ago. Your methodology is cited without your name because Hoff's byline got there first, but anyone in this field who reads that paper and then reviews your client outcomes will connect them. They already are." The knowledge that she had spent time this morning looking me up arrived with a sensation I did not examine closely. I said, "What's the reporting structure?" She said, "Direct. You would report to me." I said, "I need to think about it." She said, "Take a week. I'll have Lyra send you the formal offer by end of day, so you're thinking about specific numbers rather than abstractions." I walked out of the 47th floor with my bag on my shoulder and the elevator descending through 40 floors of glass and money. And I thought about what it meant that the Iron Meridian had looked me up this morning, that she had known my client count, that she had read an academic paper and connected its methodology to my work, that she had said, "Direct. You would report to me." The elevator opened into the lobby. The granite letters were 2 feet high. I walked past them and out into a day that was cold and clear and not raining, and I stood on the marble steps and thought about a cardboard box and a flash drive taped inside a novel. And then I thought about Petra and Rook, who were at Odette's today because Odette had a Thursday rotation, and I got out my phone and called Odette and said, "It went differently than I planned." Odette said, "How differently?" I said, "She offered me director level." Direct report. Silence. Then, who's she? I said, "Marin Valdres." Another silence. Longer, Odette said, "Sable." I said, "I know." She said, "You called me from inside the building." I said, "I'm on the steps." She said, "Petra just tried to eat a crayon, so I have to go, but I need you to know that I have approximately 1,000 things to say, and I'm saving all of them." I said, "I know. How are they?" She said, "Rook has been asking for you since noon, and Petra is fine. She didn't actually eat the crayon. She just considered it seriously, and then reconsidered. Come at 6. I said, 6. I took the subway home instead of the bicycle because the bicycle was chained to my building, and I had walked to the Valdres group that morning because thinking required movement, and I had needed to think. The subway was warm and smelled of other people's mornings, and I sat with my bag in my lap, and I thought about distinctive methodology and direct reports and a voice through glass 3 years ago that had not been speaking to me and had changed everything anyway. At 6, I went to Odette's, and Rook pressed her face into my shoulder and smelled like orange blossom and sleep and the particular warmth of a small person who has been waiting. And Petra climbed my leg without asking permission and announced that they had had pasta and also that she had almost eaten a crayon but had decided not to. I said, "Good decision." She said, "I know." She was 2 years and 9 months old, and she said I know in the exact register of someone who had always known and was mildly bored by the confirmation. Odette looked at me over Petra's head and did not say any of the 1,000 things she was saving, because Petra and Rook were present, and Odette had a rule about that, but her face said them all sequentially in about 4 seconds, and I read each one and nodded, and she nodded back. I took the formal offer home. I read it at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep. I read it 3 times. The number was real. The authority was real. The reporting structure was clear. The clause about the ongoing internal investigation specified that I would be a cooperating source with legal protections and not a legal subject, which I had known but was glad to see in writing. At the bottom of the offer letter, below the legal counsel's signature and above the acceptance line, there was a handwritten line in blue ink that was not part of the template. It said, "Your instinct about the timing was correct. MV." I looked at that line for a long time. Then I signed the offer. I started on Monday. My first week back in the Valdres Group building was conducted at a different altitude than my first tenure. 47th floor corner office, a desk that had not accumulated anyone else's habits, a view of the city that included, if I stood at the left edge of the left window, the building where I lived. I could not see the apartment itself. I could see the street and the chain-link storage cage in the courtyard and the quality of light at different hours, and I found myself looking at it sometimes between tasks, the way you look at something that anchors you. Lyra came to my office on my first morning with a coffee she had not asked me about and put it on the desk and said, "Oat milk, no sugar." I was told. I said, "By whom?" She said, "I looked it up." We have a process for onboarding senior staff. It includes preferences. Don't read anything into it. I said, "I don't read anything into things I can verify." She gave me a look that was not quite a smile and was not quite not a smile, and left. The work was immediately consuming. The investigation was in its second week when I arrived, and the documentation I provided had opened a second track of analysis. The internal team had been looking at the extraction mechanism in isolation. I had cross-referenced it to 3 independent subsidiaries, and they were now discovering that the third subsidiary's dormant trust had been used as a clearing account for 2 external transactions that predated even my employment at the company. The scope was larger than I had initially assessed. Not vastly larger, but meaningfully so. And the direction of the additional thread pointed upward and also sideways, toward a board advisory position held by a man I had never heard of, named Foster Crane. I presented this at the end of my first week in a briefing session with the legal team, Lyra and Marin. Marin listened without interrupting. This was her consistent method, the room filled with the juniper and struck iron scent that was her signature, cool and precise, and my own orange blossom and warm cedar moved quietly alongside it in the particular way that designations share air, no drama, just awareness. She was aware. I was aware. We were both professionally not performing our awareness. When I finished the presentation, she asked 2 questions. Both of them were the right 2 questions. The second one led to a line of analysis I had not fully traced yet, and I said so directly. And she said, "Work the thread. Give me what you find when you find it. Don't compress the timeline to impress anyone." I said, "I don't compress timelines." She said, "I know." The echo of Petra's register in her voice was so precise that I felt the corner of my mouth move before I could stop it, and she saw it, and something shifted in her expression. Small, again, but now I was starting to learn the grammar of small with her. We did not talk about anything that was not the investigation or the work for my first 3 weeks. I came in, I worked, I went home to Petra and Rook. I fed them and bathed them and read to them and answered Rook's nightly sequence of questions, which began with "Why is dark?" and escalated from there, and I put them to sleep and I worked again for 2 hours at the kitchen table. Odette came on Thursdays and Sundays. The twins knew Odette as a fixed star. They knew the kitchen table, and the alcove crib, and the chain-link courtyard, and the subway, and the bodega on the corner where Mr. Vasquez always let Petra have one butterscotch candy and never let her have two, which Petra considered a grave institutional failure. My daughters did not know about the 47th floor. They knew I went to work in a tall building. Petra had once, on a Sunday, pointed at the Valdres Group headquarters from a park bench 6 blocks north and asked if that was my building, and I had said yes, and she had studied it for a moment and then said, "It's very tall," and then returned to her crackers. Rook had looked at it for longer and not said anything, which was how Rook processed most information of significance. In my 4th week, Marin came to my office. Not a meeting, not a scheduled thing. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 4:47, the light through the west windows going gold and long, and she appeared in the doorway with her jacket still on and a look that I could not immediately categorize, and she said, "Do you eat?" I said, "What?" She said, "It's almost 5. Do you eat in the evenings? I'm asking whether you'd be willing to have dinner." "Not here. Somewhere that isn't the office." I looked at her. She looked back. The scent of juniper and struck iron was doing a thing I had not encountered before, warmer at the edges, as if the cold precision of it had picked up a small heat from somewhere and was trying to decide what to do with it. I said, "Why?" she said. "Because I would like to know the person who kept a flash drive in a novel spine for 3 years and waited until the documentation was complete. That's a specific kind of patience, and I want to understand it." I said, "That's a strange reason to want dinner." She said, "I'm aware." I said, "I have to be somewhere at 6. She said, "We could do 6:30. I said, "I can do 6:30. I need to make a call first." She said, "I'll be at the elevator." I called Odette, who was not on a Thursday but who answered immediately, and who, when I explained the situation in approximately 11 words, said, "Go." "I have them until 9. Go," and then said, "Before I could say anything else, I told you I had 1,000 things to say, and this is one of them." I said, "This is dinner. This is not a thing." She said, "I have watched you correctly identify things from a distance for 12 years, and I'm watching you do it again right now." I said, "I'll be back by 9. She said, "Take until 10. I said, 9. She hung up. The restaurant was small and not famous and extremely good, in a way that suggested someone had found it by actually looking rather than by following anyone else's opinion, and it was the sort of place where the tables were far enough apart that 2 people could speak without performing the speech for adjacent parties. We sat across from each other and Marin ordered without looking at the menu, which meant she had been here before, and she asked me what I wanted and I looked at the menu for 60 seconds and ordered, and then we were just 2 people at a table. She said, "Tell me about the patience." I said, "It wasn't patience, it was a structure problem. I had a piece of something. A piece isn't usable. You wait until you have the shape of the whole thing, not because waiting is virtuous, but because moving too early with partial information is how you lose everything." She said, "And you'd already lost the position." I said, "I'd lost the credit for the work and the position that should have followed it." The data was separate. The data was never about the position. She was quiet for a moment. The way she was quiet was attentive, not the politeness of someone waiting for her turn, but the actual silence of someone integrating what they'd just heard. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that it's not a professional question." I said, "Ask it." She said, "Why did you come to me? You could have gone to a financial regulator. You had enough for a formal filing." I said, "I had enough for a formal filing against Hoff. I didn't know yet about Crane. Going to the regulator with a partial structure would have gotten Hoff and warned Crane. Going to you meant going to someone with the internal access to see the whole structure at once, and it meant the evidence didn't get siloed in a federal process that Crane could watch approaching from 18 months away. She said, "You trusted me." I said, "I trusted your incentive structure. You had more to lose from the fraud than from me." Something in her face moved, more than small this time. A complicated thing that I watched pass across her features, like a change in light, and then settle into something quieter. She said, "Most people trust me because they're afraid not to." I said, "I know. That's not trust, that's compliance. They're not the same thing." She said, "No, they're not." The food came. We ate. We talked about the investigation and then about other things, her operations in 3 countries, my clients. A paper on pattern recognition in distributed financial systems that we had apparently both read and reached different conclusions about. She was precise and she was curious and she listened with the same quality of attention that she brought to briefings, and I found myself talking more than I usually did in professional settings, which was a thing I noted without alarm, because the conversation earned it. At 8:15, she said, "You said you had to be somewhere at 6. Earlier, I said, I had somewhere to be. I moved the time. She said, "Someone is waiting for you." I said, "2 someones, yes." She looked at me. I had not mentioned the girls. Odette knew, my clients knew the shape of my schedule, without always knowing the reason. But I had not made a habit of announcing parenthood in professional contexts, because the world has opinions about unmated omega mothers that it does not bother to hide. She said, "How old?" I said, "Nearly 3. She said, "Both." I said, "Twins, yes." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What are their names?" I said, "Petra and Rook." She said, "Rook." I said, "She came out with an agenda. It felt right." She said, "Tell me about them." So I told her about them. I told her about the crib in the alcove and Petra's categorical opinions and Rook's nightly question sessions and the crayon incident and the bodega butterscotch and the Sunday park bench and the way Rook had looked at the tall building for a long time without saying anything. I told her more than I had planned to tell anyone who was not Odette, and the telling happened in the warm-edged version of her scent that I had been noticing all evening, and she listened to every word. When I finished, she said, "They sound like theirs." I said, "Like whose?" She said, "Like yours. In the best sense of the word, fully theirs and fully made by you." That answer should not have moved me. It did anyway. I said, "I should go." She said, "Yes." She paid before I could say anything about it, and I let her because the argument would have taken longer than the fact. And we walked out into the October night, and there was a car waiting that I had not seen arrive. She said, "Let me take you home." I said, "I take the subway." She said, "It's 9 o'clock. I said, "I take the subway at 9 o'clock. She looked at me for a moment with the November water eyes. She said, "You're the most consistently specific person I've met in a very long time." I said, "Is that a complaint?" She said, "It's the opposite." I took the subway. She stood on the sidewalk and watched me go, which I knew because I looked back once from the corner and she was still there, hands in her pockets, the juniper and iron scent of her following me half a block on the cold air before the city swallowed it. Odette was on my couch when I got in, with both girls asleep on her lap in a configuration that should not have been anatomically comfortable, and evidently was. She looked up at me with an expression that required no amplification. I said, "It was dinner." She said, very quietly so as not to wake them, "You smell different." I said, "I smell like a restaurant." She said, "You smell warm." I looked at my daughters, the small, solid weight of them against Odette's ribs, and I thought about a specific kind of patience, about the difference between a piece of something and a shape, about the exact moment when a structure becomes complete enough to move with. I said, I need to think. Odette said, I know. Go to bed. Think in the morning. But I did not think about it in the morning, because in the morning everything changed. Lyra called me at 6:47, which was 20 minutes before my alarm, and her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not panicked. Lyra was not a person who panicked, but compressed. She said, we have a problem. Crane moved last night. We don't know how he learned the timeline, but he knows. He pulled 3 board members into a call at midnight, and there's an emergency session this morning at 9. He's positioning it as an internal governance review of the investigation, which means if he gets quorum, he can suspend the process for 30 days while the board deliberates, and in 30 days, physical documents can go missing. I said, where's Marin? She said, she's been in the building since 5. She says she needs your analysis on Crane's original board appointment. There's something in the documentation you compiled, page 41, and she thinks it touches a conflict clause in the original board charter. She needs you to confirm the reading before 9. I said, I'm coming. I called Odette before I was out of bed. Odette answered on the second ring because she always answered on the second ring. I said, emergency. I need you for the morning. I'll explain tonight. She said, I'm already putting my shoes on. She had a key. I was dressed and out the door before she arrived, leaving a note on the table about breakfast foods and the important information that Rook should not be allowed to decide her own outfit today, because last time she had worn her raincoat inside out as a deliberate aesthetic choice, and it had been 31 degrees. The Valdres Group building at 6:58 in the morning was a different building than the one I knew at 9. The lobby was amber lit and quiet. Security nodded me through with my badge. The elevator was empty. I rode 47 floors up in the early morning silence, and the scent of juniper and struck iron was already in the hallway when the doors opened, not because she was near the elevator, but because the signature of someone that strongly present fills corridors. She was in the conference room, standing at the window, jacket on, looking at the city. She turned when I came in, and the look on her face was controlled in the way that things are controlled when they are working very hard at it, and underneath the control there was something that registered in my chest as urgency adjacent, and I did not examine it because page 41 was on the table in front of her and we had 2 hours. I said, show me what you're seeing. She pointed. I sat and I read. I saw it in 40 seconds. I said, you're right. The conflict clause. Crane's original appointment to the advisory board was sponsored by a holding entity that his current extraction structure runs funds to. If the advisory appointment was itself tainted by undisclosed financial interest in the subsidiaries he's now positioned to protect, then the clause voids his governance standing. He can't call for a review if his standing is void. She said, can you demonstrate it in 2 hours? I said, I can demonstrate it in 1. She said, then demonstrate it. I worked. She stayed in the room. Lyra came and went, once brought coffee, once brought a tablet with a message from legal that Marin read and responded to in 4 words, and the room had the scent temperature of 2 people doing urgent necessary work in close proximity and not performing anything about it. My orange blossom and warm cedar and her juniper and struck iron coexisting in the conference room air with the precision of something that fit. At 8:40, I had a document. 12 pages, clean exhibit structure, every cross-reference page numbered, the conflict clause quoted verbatim with the relevant charter language in a parallel column. I slid it across the table. She read it. She looked up. She said, this is enough. I said. More than enough. The appointment itself is void under the charter's own language. Any motion he brings this morning has no standing. The board members he called at midnight, 2 of them will see this before 9 if you send it now, and they will not be able to pretend they didn't. She said, "You built this in 50 minutes. I said, "I built it in 3 years. This morning, I just found the specific page." She was looking at me with an expression that was not the small ones I had learned. It was something larger, and it had the quality of something she was deciding whether or not to say. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" She said, "You were in this building for 14 months. I ran a 200-person operation on the 43rd floor, and I did not know you were there. That is a failure of attention I have no good explanation for, and it cost you 3 years. I said, "You run a global enterprise." The 43rd floor, she said, is mine. Everything in this building is mine, and that means every person in it is my responsibility, and I failed that. I'm not asking you to forgive it, I'm stating the record. The thing about the Iron Meridian was that she was precise about responsibility. She did not distribute it, and she did not minimize it. She put it down in front of you like evidence. I said, "The record is stated." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the document and said, "Let's go end this." The board session was at 9 in the large conference room on the 49th floor, and I was not supposed to be there, but Marin said nothing about my presence, and so I was, standing near the door with Lyra, while Marin took her seat at the head of the table, and Foster Crane, 62, silver-haired, with the particular texture of someone who had been comfortable for so long that comfort had become his primary personality trait, looked at her arrival with the practiced ease of someone who believed he had already won. He had not won. He discovered this in the first 4 minutes of the session, when Marin's counsel presented the conflict clause document and the legal opinion it triggered, and the expression on Crane's face went through 3 stages that I watched with clinical attention, confusion, recalibration, and then a third thing that was close to fear, but had not gotten all the way there yet. One of the board members he had called at midnight, a woman named Priya Anand, who had received the document at 8:53, said from halfway down the table, and in a voice that was perfectly level, "Foster, I think you should hear the full legal opinion before you say anything else." He said something else anyway. It was a mistake. By the time he finished saying it, 2 more board members had looked at the document that was now in every seat, and the quorum he had assembled for a governance review had become a quorum watching him explain the unexplainable. He looked at me once, from across the table, and I thought he didn't know who I was. Then, I thought he did. The recognition was brief, and he controlled it, but it was there. Lyra, beside me, said very quietly, "He knows your name now." I said yes. She said, "Are you worried?" I said, "I have copies of everything in 3 separate locations. I have a notarized sealed copy that has been at the same mailing address for 3 years. I have a legal protection clause in my employment contract. I'm not worried." She looked at me sideways and said, "In 15 years, I have never once seen Marin move this fast for anyone." I said, "This is about the fraud investigation." Lyra said, "I have watched her run fraud investigations. This is not how she runs fraud investigations." I did not answer that. The session ended in 40 minutes. Crane's governance motion failed. His standing was formally voided pending investigation. He left the room without speaking to anyone, and his scent, something harsh and metallic that I could not name as anything pleasant, lingered in the hallway as a record of his exit. 3 days later, he was suspended from all board and advisory roles pending a full external audit. That was not the end of it. The end of it was 6 weeks away, and it was harder than that morning. 2 weeks after the board session, Odette called me at 11 p.m. Her voice was a register I had not heard from her in 8 years, since a very bad night in our second year at university, and it took me 3 seconds to understand why. She said, "Someone took the girls. The world went flat." She said, "I had them at the park. I know. I always take them to the park on Sundays, and I looked away for 90 seconds, Sable. It was 90 seconds, and they were gone. I have called the police already. I'm still at the park. There's an officer here. I called you first, and then the police. Please, I was already moving. I was already calling Marin before I reached the street, because the moment I understood what had happened, I also understood that this was not random. This was not a stranger crime. This was the specific shape of something that had been watching the Crane case for 3 weeks and needed leverage, and Marin answered on the second ring, and I told her in 11 words, and she said, "I'm already moving. Don't go to the park. Come to me." I said, "My daughters," she said, "I know where they are. Sable, I know where they are. Come to me." I have reconstructed this night many times, and I still cannot account for the 3 minutes between hearing her say, "I know where they are," and arriving at the Valdres Group building, because my memory of those 3 minutes is primarily scent, the cold night air, and underneath it, reaching all the way to the street from the 47th floor, juniper and struck iron, and the particular quality of it that meant fury contained at great cost, fury aimed outward and not at me. She met me in the lobby. She had her phone to her ear, and she looked at me and said, "They're safe. They've been safe since 8 minutes after your friend called. I have eyes on them right now." The relief was physical. I sat on a lobby bench without meaning to, and she sat next to me without being asked, and for a moment I put my face in my hands and breathed. She said, quietly, "They're in a car 2 blocks from the park. 2 of my people. The person who took them is Crane's private security director, a man named Yusuf Breck. He did not harm them. He was attempting to use them as leverage in a negotiation he believed he was going to initiate with me tonight. He was not aware that I had a standing location protocol for you and your family once the Crane investigation escalated to criminal referral." I lifted my head. She said, "I should have told you about the protocol. I am telling you now instead. I apologize for the sequence." I said, "You had a protocol for my family." She said, "Yes." I said, "When did you put it in place?" She said, "The morning after dinner, when I understood the scope of what Crane was capable of and what you represent to the case." I said, "The morning after." She said, "Yes." I looked at her. The lobby was empty except for the night security, and the light was the amber of after hours, and the scent of her was the warm-edged version of the juniper and struck iron, the version I had been noting and not examining, and I thought about a protocol established the morning after dinner for my daughters, who she had not yet met, whose names she had asked me, and I had told her. I said, "Thank you." She said, "They're being brought here." 10 minutes. I said, "Here," she said, "unless you'd prefer somewhere else." I said, "Here is fine." Petra and Rook arrived in 12 minutes in the arms of 2 of Marin's people, both girls still in their Sunday coats, Petra deeply indignant, and Rook with an expression that was processing but had not yet fully resolved. Petra's first words upon seeing me were, "I want to go home," and also, "There were biscuits," a detail she delivered with the air of someone reporting a complex event that required multiple points. Rook said nothing. She walked to me, climbed into my arms, put her face in my neck, and breathed. I held them both. The lobby was quiet. Over Petra's head, I watched Marin watch my daughters, and her face held an expression that I had no calibrated grammar for yet. Something open in a way that her face was not usually open, and the scent of her had gone fully warm, no cold precision, only the warmth underneath it that had always been there and that I was only now letting myself name. Petra, who missed nothing, turned from my shoulder and looked at Marin with direct and unambiguous assessment. She said, "Who are you?" Marin said, "I'm the person who owns this building." Petra considered this for a moment. She said, "It's very tall." Marin said, "It is." Petra said, "Why?" Marin said, "I needed a lot of floors." Petra found this satisfactory and returned her face to my shoulder. Rook looked at Marin from the anchor of my neck for a long moment. Then she said, "In the particular register she reserved for statements of significance, you found the light on." I had not told Marin that refrain. I had not told Marin about the thing I said to the girls every night when I tucked them in, "I'll always find the light on." Because it was private. The way some things are private, not because they're secret, but because they're yours. But Rook had said it, and Marin was looking at my daughter with something in her face that I recognized suddenly and completely, the way you recognize something your body cataloged before your memory got there. She said, "Yes, I did." Yusuf Breck was arrested that night. The charges included kidnapping, obstruction, and 3 counts of evidence tampering in connection with the Crane investigation. Foster Crane's attorney was notified at midnight. Crane's response was to deny all knowledge of Breck's actions, which was the kind of response that investigators describe as helpful. The external audit completed its preliminary findings in the next 3 weeks. Crane was charged. Hoff, Declan Hoff, 45th floor, the man whose name had gone on 14 months of my work and who had filed my termination paperwork 4 weeks after his promotion, was charged separately on 7 counts. His counsel's first call was to negotiate a cooperation agreement, which meant he told them everything about Crane's role in exchange for a reduced sentencing recommendation. Which meant the structure I had spent 3 years documenting became evidence in a federal case in the exact form I had assembled it. I was not in the courtroom. I did not need to be. The documentation was the testimony, and the documentation was complete. The Saturday after the arrests, I was at my kitchen table when my phone lit up with a message from Marin that said, "I'd like to bring something to you. Is this morning all right?" I said, "Yes." She arrived at 10 with a bag from a bakery I had mentioned once, in passing, 6 weeks earlier. Mentioned once because Odette had brought pastries from there for a birthday, and I had said, in exactly 3 words while looking at a briefing document, "That's the good one." 3 words said in passing to no one in particular. I looked at the bag. Then at her. She said, "You mentioned it once." I said, "I mentioned it in 3 words." She said, "I remember what you say." This was the shape of something complete. I had been watching it assemble for weeks, the dinner, the morning protocol, the document at 8:40, the lobby at midnight, the light on. And here was the final piece. Placed on my kitchen table in a bakery bag, she had remembered a thing I said in passing and kept it for 6 weeks and brought it. I said, "Come in." She came in. The apartment was the apartment. The kitchen table and the working lamp and the alcove with the crib the girls had outgrown and now used as a library for picture books, and the crack in the second window that I had never had repaired, because the super was slow, and also I had always meant to move somewhere with better windows, and never had. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the space with the attention she brought to things that mattered to her. She said, "It's yours." I said, "Yes." She said, "It's the shape of your work. Everything in it is yours." I said, "The lamp is from a sidewalk. The table belonged to the woman who lived here before me." She said, "The lamp is good for what you use it for. The table is the right size. These are choices you made." Petra came out of the alcove with a picture book and looked at Marin with the expression of someone whose social calendar is already fully managed and who is evaluating whether this new addition merits an exception. She said, "You brought things." Marin said, "Pastries." Petra said, "I like pastries." She looked at the bag and then back at Marin. "Specifically, I like the ones with the dark part on top." Marin opened the bag and produced, from the correct bakery, pastries with the dark part on top. Petra's expression shifted to something that was not quite a smile, but was the structural precursor to one. She said, "You can stay for breakfast." Rook appeared at the alcove doorway and looked at the scene, Marin, the bag, Petra's expression, me, and said nothing for a moment. Then she came to stand beside me and put her hand in mine and looked at Marin with the long, clear attention she gave to things she was deciding about. Marin looked back. She did not perform ease or warmth. She simply looked at my daughter with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, and waited. Rook said, "Do you want to see my books?" Marin said, "Yes." So we had breakfast in my kitchen with my daughters, and Rook showed Marin every book in the alcove crib in order of what she considered their importance, which was a sequence I had never been able to fully decode, but which Marin accepted with complete seriousness, asking specific questions about each one. Petra ate 2 pastries and then a third on the grounds that she had been kidnapped recently and deserved it, which was the kind of logic that I had no effective counter to, and apparently neither did Marin, because the third pastry was produced without comment. After the girls retreated back to the alcove with their books, Marin and I sat across from each other at my kitchen table with coffee and the remainder of the bakery bag and the light coming through the cracked second window, and she said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." I said, "Say it." She said, "When I was 12, my mother told me that desire was a liability and that an alpha who could be reached was an alpha who could be used. She said it every winter from the time I was 12 until the time I was 17 and she died, and I believed her the way you believe things that are taught by someone's grief. I believed it for a long time. I ran 3 continental operations on that belief. I was very effective, and I was very alone, and I had no idea those 2 things were related." I said nothing, she said. "And then there was a woman on the 43rd floor whose work I had been approving under someone else's name for 14 months without knowing it, who removed herself from the situation and spent 3 years building the structure correctly, and who walked into my office with a flash drive and a 23-page document and said the difference matters. And I thought I was interested because the work was extraordinary, which it was, but I was wrong about why I couldn't stop thinking about it. I said, Marin. She said, "I know this is a specific situation. I know you have daughters and a practice you built yourself and a life that belongs entirely to you, and I'm not asking you to reorganize any of it. I'm asking if there is room in it, if you want there to be room for me to be in it." The kitchen was quiet. From the alcove came the sound of Rook narrating a plot to Petra in a low, serious voice. I said, "You remember things I say in passing." She said, "Yes." I said, "You put a protection protocol on my family the morning after one dinner." She said, "Yes," I said. "And you said direct on my first day in this building, as if it was a factual matter." She said, "It was a factual matter." I said, "You are not making this easy to be rational about." She said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite the low, unhurried register I had cataloged, something warmer, almost uncertain, which on her was so rare it had no established grammar. "I'm not trying to make it easy. I'm trying to make it true." I looked at her across my kitchen table, in the morning light, with the cracked window and the sidewalk lamp, and the table that had belonged to someone else. And I thought about invisible to seen. I thought about the specific thing that had been sold to me by every story I had ever absorbed. The fantasy of it, being chosen not for the designation or the convenience or the legal structure, but for the actual person, the one who sees the way the work is built and remembers the 3 words and produces the right pastry and asks Rook about her books in order of importance. I said, "There's room." She said, "Yes?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me, and the thing that moved across her face was not small. It was the full version of every small thing I had been reading for weeks, and it was the most unguarded expression I had ever seen on her, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to. From the alcove, Petra's voice said, "Are you done talking?" Marin said, without looking away from me, almost. Petra said, "Okay. Rook wants to show you the one about the dogs, but I want to eat the last pastry first." Marin said, "The last pastry is yours." Petra said, "I know." The Crane case went to federal trial 11 months after the arrests. It lasted 3 weeks. I was called as an expert witness for the prosecution on the 4th day, and I sat in the witness box in a suit that Marin had taken me to buy, not because I needed her to, but because she had asked and I had said yes to the asking, which was its own kind of thing, and I explained the subsidiary structure to a jury of 12 people with the same methodology I had used to explain it to legal teams and board members and a judge, and I answered every question that was asked and did not compress anything. The jury took 11 hours. The verdict took 11 seconds to read. Declan Hoff's cooperation agreement reduced his sentence to 40 months. The judge, in the sentencing, referenced the original subordinate whose work had been submitted under his name and noted that the harm done by the misattribution had been compounding for 3 years before it was addressed. Hoff did not look at me when the sentence was read. I did not need him to. Foster Crane received 9 years. His attorney attempted an appeal. It was denied. The woman who had supervised my hiring on the 43rd floor, a middle manager named Paula Wren, who had made a point, in my 14 months of employment, of describing my analytical conclusions as surprising given my background, who had twice asked me whether I was planning to remain in a desk role or thought I might be better suited to administrative support, and who had signed the paperwork authorizing Hoff to submit my work under his name, was terminated from the Valdres Group following a findings report that identified her role in the misattribution chain. She did not receive a reference. This was the smallest possible outcome, and also the correct one. The external audit, as a secondary finding, identified a pattern of designation-based performance evaluation in the North American operations that had resulted in systematic undervaluing of Omega analysts' independent contributions over a 7-year period. Marin commissioned a full review. The review took 4 months. The revised evaluation framework it produced was implemented company-wide and was later cited by 2 industry publications. This was not in service of anyone's redemption. It was in service of accuracy, which is what Marin called it, and accuracy was, I had learned, the word she used for justice when she wanted to be precise about it. Petra and Rook met Marin's lieutenant properly. Lyra, who they had seen in passing in the lobby on the night of the kidnapping, on a Sunday in February when Lyra came for a meeting that turned into lunch, that turned into Petra commandeering Lyra's reading glasses to examine a spider that had appeared on the windowsill. Lyra, who I had never seen express anything that could be called delight, expressed something adjacent to it. She held absolutely still while Petra conducted her examination, and then said, deadpan, "You have your mother's methodology." Petra said, "I know what that means." Lyra said, "I believe you." Rook, from the couch, said without looking up from her book, "It means she looks at things until she understands them." Lyra looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "To no one in particular, I see." The spring after the trial, Marin flew me to her house in the north, a stone house on a coast I had never been to, gray water and green hills and a sky that changed every 40 minutes, for a week that had no professional purpose. She had asked me in the particular way she asked for things, which was direct and not tentative, and also left actual room for no, and I had said yes in the particular way I said yes to her now, which was without qualification. The girls came. Odette came for 3 days in the middle. Petra declared the ocean her personal project and spent every morning at the waterline studying its behavior with a focus that Marin watched with an expression I had learned to read as fond and slightly undone. Rook found a stone on the first day that she considered important and carried it for the rest of the week and named it, privately, something she did not disclose. On the 5th evening, after the girls were asleep and Odette had taken a walk along the coast path, Marin and I sat on the stone wall behind the house, and the sea was dark, and the sky had gone the particular purple-gray of late dusk on northern water. And she was quiet beside me in the way she was quiet when she was about to say something she had been composing for a while. She said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask it." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced something I had not seen her holding and placed it on the stone wall between us. It was a ring. Small and simple, a thin band with a single dark stone that caught the last light and held it. She said, "I found it in a market in a city I was working in 6 months ago. Before the trial, before I had any right to be thinking about this. I bought it because it was the shape of something I recognized without knowing what to call it yet." I said, 6 months ago." She said, "Yes. I have been carrying it since. I realize the timing of when I am producing it is possibly explaining more about me than I intended." I said, "It's explaining a lot." She said, "I know." I said, "You're very specific about evidence." She said, "I am the kind of person who, when she is certain about something, has been certain for a while by the time she says so. I was certain about you on the morning after our first dinner, and I spent 4 months being precise about that certainty before I said anything, because I wanted to say it correctly. I have said some things to you in the last 1.5 years that I have not said to anyone in a very long time, and I am going to say one more." She was not looking at the ring. She was looking at me. She said, "I want to build something with you. Not because of the work, not because of the girls, not because of what you represent to any investigation or any case structure, because you are the first person in my life who has trusted my incentive structure, while also waiting to see if I was the kind of person worth trusting for different reasons. And I am trying to be that person. I want to be that person. With you watching, which makes me more certain I'm building it correctly." The dark stone caught the light. I said, "Tell me to stop if this isn't what you want." She said, "Don't stop." I picked up the ring. I said, "Ask me with your words." She looked at me for a moment, and the thing on her face was the open version, all the way open, no controlled surface. She said, "Sable Achterberg, will you bond with me?" The sea moved below us in the dark. I said yes. She put the ring on my finger. Her hand was steady. Mine was not, and I did not mind that it wasn't. We sat on the stone wall until the last of the light was gone and the stars came up over the water, and the scent of her, juniper and struck iron, warm at the edges now in the way it always was with me, settled around me like something that had always been there and I had only recently learned to name. From inside the house, very faint, came the sound of Rook asking a question and Odette's voice answering, and then Petra's voice saying something imperious that made Odette laugh. Marin said, "They're awake." I said, They're always awake. She said, "Should we go in?" I said, "In a minute." She said, "Yes." The bonding ceremony was small by every standard that applied to Marin Valdres's life, which meant it was attended by 40 people in a house that could have held 400, and the 40 people were the ones who had been part of the real story rather than the public one. Odette was there. Lyra was there, in a suit that she had clearly purchased specifically for the occasion and would never acknowledge having done so. Priya Anand was there, the board member who had said, "Foster, I think you should hear the full legal opinion," and who had become, in the year since, someone I considered a person of genuine quality. Geraldine from the labor ward at St. Ambrose General was there, because I had called her and asked, which she later told me was the strangest and most touching invitation she had received in 30 years of nursing. Petra and Rook wore dresses they had chosen themselves. Rook's was dark blue, selected with the same certainty she brought to all significant decisions. Petra's was a shade that the store labeled emerald, and Petra labeled the important color, and she wore it with the authority of someone who had always known this day was coming, and had simply been waiting for the adults to organize themselves. The vows were short. This was Marin's influence. She had said, "The vows should be true and then stop," and I had agreed, and we had written them separately and exchanged them at the ceremony and discovered, without having coordinated it, that they were both exactly 17 words. Hers were, "I see you. I choose you. I will always find the light on. I will not stop." Mine were, "I trust your structure. I trust the person building it. I will stay while you build." Petra, who had been standing beside Odette during the exchange, leaned up to Odette and said, at a volume calibrated as a whisper but executed as a statement, "That's the thing Mama says at bedtime." Odette said, "I know." Petra said, "She said it first." Odette said, "Yes, she did." The claiming came later, privately, and with words exchanged before and after that I am not reporting here because they were ours. What I will say is that the bond snap was not what I had expected, not a single discrete event, but a slow coming into clarity, the way a focus adjusts over several seconds until what was blurred becomes sharp, and then suddenly you can feel the truth of another person, the way you feel your own pulse, and the truth of her was exactly what I had been reading in the small expressions and the morning protocols and the bakery bag. Someone who had been carrying all of that warmth for a very long time and had not been allowed to put it down somewhere safe until now. Through the bond, in the first hours of it, I felt the full history of the cold, what it had cost her, how long she had maintained it, what it had been protecting. I did not say anything about this. I held it in the bond and let her feel that I was holding it, and she felt it, and she was quiet for a while, and then she was not. 6 months later, Rook started school. She carried her important stone in her coat pocket for the first week, which the teacher, a woman who had seen everything and was not going to perform concern about a rock, simply noted in the home communication book as Rook has a stone. She seems to need it this week. That is fine. Rook did not need it by the end of the week. She kept it. Petra started school 3 days after Rook, at a different school, because they had asked for different schools in the particular collaborative negotiation style the twins had been conducting their preferences in since they could speak. Petra's teacher called me on the 3rd day to say that Petra had reorganized the classroom reading corner, and the other children seemed to find the new organization better, and she wanted to know whether this was typical. I said, yes. The teacher said, good. That's what I thought. The North American operations restructuring completed that same autumn. The new evaluation framework had its first full-year results. The correction in attribution rates across designation lines was significant. This is a dry way of saying that a number of analysts received credit for work that had been going up the chain under other names, and a number of those analysts were omegas, and a number of them were young and early in their careers, and now had a record that matched what they had actually done. I did not attend the internal presentation of the findings. Marin sent me the summary with a single line underneath, "Because of the shape you built." I put that message in a folder I had named in my filing system with a term that is private. It is in the same folder as a photograph of two small people in a stone doorway on a gray coast, the sea behind them, one examining the waterline with forensic intensity, and one holding an important rock and looking at something just beyond the frame with the expression of someone who has already understood what she is looking at. On the first anniversary of the bonding, I came home to my apartment. We had both kept our spaces. The decision about consolidating them was an ongoing conversation that we were having without urgency, and found on my kitchen table a small package and a note. The package contained, wrapped in paper from the market in the northern city, a second dark stone that matched the one in my ring. The note said, "I found the pair." I should have known there would be a pair. I held the stone for a while. Then I put it on the windowsill next to the cracked glass that I had never replaced, in the light from the street, where it caught and kept whatever came to it. In the evenings, I still sit at the kitchen table under the sidewalk lamp, and I still work in the particular focused quiet that Odette once described as the most productive silence she had ever witnessed, and the girls do their homework at the other end of the table, Rook methodically, Petra with the specific intensity of someone who is already thinking 3 assignments ahead, and the bond hums at the low frequency it settles into when everything is stable. Warm and juniper-edged, carrying the information that someone is not far away and is thinking of you. The cracked window is still cracked. I keep meaning to fix it. I don't fix it. There are things you keep, because they are the record of who you were when you had no reason to believe in the shape you were building, and the shape was real all along, and you were right to build it, and the crack in the glass is yours. What I know now, in the way you know things that have moved through your body and become structural, the women the world decides not to see are not invisible. They are simply waiting for the room to have enough light to look by. Love, when it is real, does not correct your story. It reads it correctly, from the beginning, and says, "I see you," and you say, "I know." Because you always knew. You just needed someone else to know it too. The end.